All right, thank you very much. So what do you do? First off, I didn't know what everybody else was going to be talking about, and I realized, though, that probably by the end of the day, we have done what we call in the Marine Corps, we've scared the children. We have really talked about some very dark and dangerous things, and they are. Our previous speakers have done an incredible job of really defining just what a bent and broken world we live in. And so I decided to take a note from a much greater man than me, you know, President Eisenhower, who used to say, if you have an insurmountable problem, what do you do with it? You make it bigger. To try to figure out, you know, what are you going to do to address these issues? And I felt that one of my responsibilities at the end of this thing was to essentially talk about, well, what can we do? What can we do as individuals? What can we do as communities? What can we do as a nation? So I put together, and by the way, I'm suffering from real PowerPoint envy because I don't really do PowerPoint very much, but because this is the first time I've ever really delivered this, I figured I'd better have some notes. So that's what we're getting today. And so the first thing I probably ought to do is define resilience. And I'm not going to read it to you or insult anybody's intelligence. I'll just talk while you're reading that. And essentially speaking, what you should know is there are folks out there that are thinking about resilience. Now, there's an organization called the Global Resilience Institute in Northeastern University in Boston. And Dr. Flynn, who is the director of that, asked me to come on board. Now, what he did was he said, Mike, I'm going to make you a distinguished senior fellow. And boy, that really sounded good. What I found out in academia, if they give you a really good title, it means you don't get paid. But that's okay, because I've got two sons in Boston. It gives me a great opportunity to go out there and see them every once in a while. But the goal of resilience is to make you better at either preventing or recovering from the bad things that will happen to us. And let's face it, as individuals, as communities, as nations, as hard as we try, we cannot predict all the bad things that will happen to us. We just know they will happen. So what are we going to do? And I began thinking about resilience before I ever knew what to call it. And I'll go to the, this is my story. I'm going to tell some stories. Right after I gave up Guantanamo, the reason I was there very shortly was that I was what they call force listed to lead about 5,000 Marines and sailors in the event that the United States decided to invade Iraq. They wanted to get me back so badly, it told me pretty clearly that we probably had already planned to invade Iraq. So my job was to run the international supply chain all the way back to the United States, through Kuwait, and up into Baghdad to support a fellow by the name of Jim Mattis, who was leading the division as they were going north. And so I felt, okay, Marine Corps doctrinally normally provides logistics support from the high water mark to 20 miles inland. Okay, Lehnert, you've got 6,000 miles. Yeah, there's not much difference. But at the end of the war, at least my part of it, because when we got to Baghdad in 17 days, those are the three things that I worried about the most. Meals ready to eat, 5.56 ball ammunition, and BA 5590 batteries. You know, beans, bullets, and batteries. And if you think about it, those are the things you need to fight a war. And yet we very nearly ran out. If it had taken General Mattis, General Conway, and General Amos, by the way, all first names were Jim. I kind of figured out that they needed to, that's what you needed to be able to be in charge. But we almost ran out. In that logistics pipeline, in many cases, we had less than 8 days of supply left. And I got to thinking, you know, as a logistician, I'd always been told, don't worry about it. You know, the industrial base of the United States will surge anytime you have any problems. Well, we knew we were going in, and guess what? They didn't surge. There were only two companies that made MREs, one that made 5.56 ball ammunition, one that made batteries. By the way, the batteries, I went out to Australia, Israel, and to China. I broke so many federal acquisition regulations to get those things, to get knockoffs and bring them in. But it made me realize we weren't as good as we thought we were. Our logistics capability and capacity, I heard somebody use the term today, brittle. We were brittle. So, tell you another story. Tale of two airplane rides. Okay, the first one. My eldest son was a loose fellow in Beijing as a neuroscientist. He wasn't smart enough to get into the Marine Corps, so Harvard sent him to Beijing. So I'd use that opportunity with my wife to travel to China and travel all over the area. So we happened to be in Lushan in the middle of the earthquake, April 2013. It was a bad earthquake. 196 Chinese died, 24 were never found, and over 11,000 were injured, okay? I was at the airport when the earthquake occurred. They ran a truck up and down the airfield to make sure that it was still intact. The air traffic control center was knocked out. It was no longer functional. They switched to an alternate, and with a 30-minute delay, I went back to Beijing. Okay, now fast forward, 10 July 2017. I'm sitting on the runway in Ronald Reagan Airport, and a worker working on top of the roof of the Washington, D.C. Air Traffic Control Center accidentally spills 2 quarts of sealant into the air conditioning ducts in the Air Traffic Control Center. That shuts down Baltimore, Dulles, and Washington Reagan. Oh, by the way, they had no backup. They had nobody to turn to. Flights were delayed for about 4 hours until they finally figured out that it was not a terrorist assault. It was 2 quarts of sealant. And we finally made it at least as far as Atlanta. I never could figure out how I get to Traverse City, Michigan from going through Atlanta, but that's the way we did it. And so I spent that night on the floor of the airport with 1,000 of my new best friends. Because there wasn't the capacity in Atlanta to handle the surge for the passengers that were stranded there. Once again, I got to thinking, just how resilient are we? Okay, now I'm going to talk about infrastructure a little bit, and I'm not going to mention cybersecurity, but when I talk about infrastructure, I'm talking about cyber infrastructure as well. I'm absolutely talking about it. But many of you, some of you out there are even older than me, know and remember the Eisenhower administration when we built the interstate system. And you would know that it's the National Highway System, I'll have to get this exact title, was actually the National System of Interstate, State, and Defense Highways. Think about that. It was built because it was recognized, Eisenhower understood that it was absolutely essential to be able to move people and things across our nation. Now, right now, as nearly as I can determine, the latest data that I have is from 2013. I guess we're not talking about it anymore. The US ranks 25th in the world in quality of infrastructure. Some of you have traveled internationally to some of our, go to the Beijing airport. It's, what's the British term? It's gobsmacking. It's incredible. Now we spend 0.05%, 0.0, put the 0 in there, don't forget, of our gross domestic product on infrastructure. You know, we're talking about an infrastructure bill with $20 billion in it and saying, you know, we're doing high fives. China spends $200 billion per annum on infrastructure. Think about that. They spend 8.5% of their GDP. Some of you have heard about the One Belt and One Road. They're not even thinking about China. They're thinking globally. They're thinking globally. And they're looking at where they need to put their infrastructure in order to achieve the resilience that they need. We aren't doing that. Okay. And there's the problem, part of the problem. I've heard some comments today which I thought were real good about what's the role of government? What's the role of the individual? And I always use the lighthouse problem. Economists talk about this. I'm from, I live in northern Michigan, so we've got a lot of lighthouses around the Great Lakes. Now, there's no one single company that's going to buy a lighthouse. You can't make the economic argument that one company is going, a shipping company is going to buy a lighthouse and advantage every other shipping company. It's one of those things that's just an essential role of government. You got to have lighthouses so you don't have ships running aground. But the problem we have in this country, and I'm speaking as a logistician, and I talk about supply chains, just-in-time delivery and everything else. And in times, when times are good, That's a great idea. That's a great idea. When times are bad, you need to have stuff all ready to go. You need to have redundancy. You need to have resiliency. But in our current situation, how many of us traveled to get here today? I mean, took an airplane ride. Okay, I did. A couple other speakers did. You know, and I don't know how you chose to buy your ticket, but essentially what I did was I picked the cheapest ticket at the least objectionable schedule. That's what I picked. And that's how most of us do it. And that makes sense from an individual standpoint. But if you watch, these airplanes are all loaded up. I mean, if one plane breaks, you know what happens. You've all been stranded, even though you didn't have to fly here today. You've all been stranded. You know what happens when they have to find another plane somewhere, because the airlines, for economic reasons, are operating at capacity. And you know, the argument is, and probably makes a great deal of sense, that we need national standards for many of the things that we rely upon to ensure that when the bad times come, and believe me, they will, we're ready for it. So let's talk about reducing vulnerabilities a little bit. You know, I look at, you know, resilience in two things. You know, what do you do to prevent bad things from happening? I'm a Marine, I'm kind of simple. And what do you do when bad things happen? So I'm going to tell another story. We all know where we were in 9/11. I was enjoying the good life at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Actually, my place of birth as well. And you know, 9/11 occurred, and the first thing that happened, like it did on every single base, is that we basically shut everything down, closed everything off, and said, okay, you know, nobody can get us. Well, if you've ever, how many of you have been to Camp Lejeune? How many of you have ever, okay, you've been to the cultural epicenter of the universe. Congratulations. And so we've got 17 miles that we share on an intercoastal waterway, right? And an estuary, the Neuse River, you know, huge, beautiful, broad river with a lot of folks using it. So our first, what does a Marine try to do? We tried to close it down, all right? We were told you can't do that. You know, you've got, you know, shipping that's going through there. You've got other people that have every legal right to use it. So we figured, okay, how do we protect this? And we had all the security people. And now I had an operational command, so I really didn't have to be in this meeting, but I'm sitting there and everybody was talking about, well, what do we do? You know, we've been told we cannot, you know, we tried to shut it down for one day and it didn't work. So I finally, you know, I don't think it was a very brilliant idea, but I finally said, listen, we've got shrimpers and crabbers here that have been here for generations. They're on that water. They know everybody that's supposed to be on that water. They know everybody that's not supposed to be on that water. Why don't we just give them radios? Why don't we just you don't have to give them the highfalutin radios, just a push to talk. Hey, this is Billy Bob. I see somebody out here that I've never seen before, and I don't know who he is. Well, they thought that was a pretty good idea. And then the base security officer said, well, should we arm them too? And I said, no, you don't have to worry about that. They're all armed. Every one of them is. Every one of them's packing. Now, talk a little bit about, this is the way I think about resilience. To me, there's individual resilience. How do you and I respond when bad things happen? When your computer gets hacked, you know, when your house burns down, what do you do? How do you handle it? And you know this, you've been through it, you're all old enough to know some people do pretty darn well and some collapse and fall apart. Now, I'm not going to embarrass anybody here, so I'm going to frame this question in the negative. So listen very carefully how I say it so you don't raise your hand for the wrong reason. How many of you don't think it's important to take personal prevention measures to make sure that your house doesn't burn down or that your computer doesn't get hacked? How many of you think that's just not important? Okay, I shouldn't see any hands. It's all, okay, good. That's excellent. I will tell you that that question, when it's asked, about 98% of the people agree with you. Then when you ask them, how many of you have done anything, and get specific, less than half will tell you they have done nothing at all. That should scare us. But when I'm talking about making the problem greater, what I'm suggesting is as a nation, We ought to recognize bad things are going to happen to us as a nation, as a community, and as individuals. And we ought to start thinking about how we do it both from the private sector and the public sector. You know, I told you the story about the shrimpers and the crabbers and everything. What we basically did was integrated the public sector and the private sector, because we all had a shared desire to make sure that we were secure. And yet, somehow or another, we always think in silos about how we're going to solve a problem. And this is not, you know, this is not TSA's problem. It's not FEMA's problem. It's our problem as Americans. So I think I would suggest that that may be a good way to do it. Some of you may have read Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. Pretty good book. And it talks about how societies fail. And in the book, you know, he discusses 4 ways that societies fail. And he goes through a whole bunch of different examples of how societies fail. Societies sometimes fail to anticipate a problem before it arises. They just don't see it coming. Second way it happens is a problem does arrive, and they just fail to perceive it. It was there all along, they just didn't see it. Third, they perceive it, but they just don't try to solve it. And lastly, they try to solve it and they fail. Now, that sounds pretty obvious, you know, but I'm a Marine, I kind of deal with the obvious. That sounds like really obvious things. Golly, you know, they ought to be able to figure this stuff out. Well, if you think it's really that obvious, ask the Easter Islanders, ask the Mayans, you know, ask the Anasazi, you know, ask the Vikings that first tried to settle Greenland, okay? Those were societies that all failed. We don't want to be one of those societies. So we got to start saying, okay, let's take the bad things that all of these really great folks have talked about, and let's try to figure out what we're going to do about it. But I would argue that it's probably not a good idea to try to say, well, that's government's problem. Let's just outsource it, vote them in, vote them out, and continue. I mean, it is government's problem. But the first thing I'd say is, you know, in terms of yourself, I told you I live in northern Michigan. I got a chance to come down here. By the way, you have wonderful weather. I left it. It was 8 degrees out when I left, 8. It was a 35-knot wind, and we had 11 inches of brand new snow, okay? But you know what? We're used to that stuff. So the plane took off on time. It was okay. There are certain things that I don't worry about up there. The last time that anybody's had anything stolen in our neighborhood was $20 worth of honeysuckle apples about 4 years ago from an unmanned market, a roadside market. I mean, we just don't have a lot of crime issues, but we do have other things. You know, we have windstorms, we have fires, and so you know, I've done my own self-assessment. You know, I've got enough food to keep me going for probably 6 months. You know, I've got a generator now, and Dave came out and helped me when the trees blew down. And unless I hurt myself with a chainsaw, I'm in pretty good shape. But, you know, as you're thinking about your own self-assessment, you know, each community is going to be different. But I'd ask the questions is, have you done the things in your home that you should do? Did you put the patches on your computer to make sure that the viruses don't, you know, or do you push not now, okay, I'll get to it later, and you never do, okay? Do you know who your neighbors are? And do you help each other? I don't think actually, other than the weather, your community is much different than mine. You've got a lot more people, but you know, it sounds like people know each other and they help each other. And that's part of the resilience thing. That's part, you know, don't wait for, and this is not a pejorative thing, don't wait for government to help you. You shouldn't. You should all work together. We should. How am I doing on time? Because I want to make time for the video. I'll tell you a quick story because we talked about scenarios a little bit. I was running all the bases west of the Mississippi, and I asked my staff. I think there was the discussion about having the Pentagon, bring in the movie. The writers and everything. Well, I asked my staff, I said, put together the worst possible scenario that could hit us. And one of them that they came up with was a Marine Corps jet is shot down by a terrorist, crashes into a community, in San Diego. So we worked through what we would do. Well, I was on my way to the East Coast, headquarters Marine Corps, and I'm on the runway, and I see a fire that is, if you've been around aircraft, you know what it is. We've had a plane go down. I'm already, my phone's turned off. I can't do anything. I don't know what's happening. When I land in Chicago to change planes, my phone is lit up. It was an F-18. It had a serious malfunction. It crashed into a suburban area in San Diego, killing, some of you may have heard about this, killing a Korean family, legally here, a grandmother, a mother, and 2 baby girls. The only thing that wasn't in that scenario is it didn't go down as a result of a terrorist crash. So immediately I go to see the assistant commandant of the Marine Corps, and I'm telling him what, we've worked through this thing and what we ought to do. And he looks at me and he says, Mike, that wasn't your airplane that went down. That wasn't your pilot. You don't own the plane. You don't own the pilot. But based upon what you've told me, you own the problem. And so I dealt with that to work with the community, be honest with the community, work with the Koreans. I was working all the way back to the Korean Peninsula to make sure that they understood. We brought the Secretary of the Navy out to, despite what the lawyers told me, apologize to the family, because that's part of the Asian culture. You apologize. They're not litigious like what they want to have is the biggest guy you can get there to apologize and say that they're sorry. And that's what we did. But, you have to think through, what are you going to do when bad things happen? So, let's see where we are. So, when we're creating these resilient societies that I'm talking about, what I'm hopeful that we would do, and we would come up with, is first understand, does anybody here think that we're going to completely cure or stop terrorism? Does anybody here think that? I hope not. We're not going to. Terrorism is like the flu. You address one strain and another strain is going to come up. But we need to ask ourselves as a society, how are we going to address these things? How are we going to address natural disasters? And I would also suggest that we may need to talk to other countries. If we want to talk about how to address earthquakes, because they sure do happen on the West Coast, let's talk to the Japanese. They've been dealing with it for a long time. How do we address, say, flooding? Well, the Dutch have sort of got that sorted out. Maybe we ought to talk to them and start learning. But I finally, and most importantly, I think we need to get away from the concept that the lowest cost equals the best option for our society. Because you're going to pay sooner or later. You're going to pay. Pay me now, pay me later. You're going to pay me. So we ought to be thinking about, how we're going to be, how our society is going to address the things that happen when things go wrong. Now, I'm going to ask for your help here. Eric, it's Eric, right? With a C or a K? C, okay. I have a son with Eric with a K. Before we start the video, I have a question for you. What was the single greatest maritime evacuation in history? Dunkirk is the second greatest maritime evacuation in history. Anybody? Anybody else? Who said that? Oh, the FEMA guy. Perfect, yes. And I'm going to show you a short video, and then I'll take questions. And the reason I wanted to show you this video is because it demonstrates many of the aspects. We've got to finish this on a positive note, right? We've had a lot of dark stuff today. If you go to church, you know that if every sermon is about you're going to go to hell, and there's no redemption, you're probably going to find another church. Okay, so there is redemption, and I want you to see a very positive story about Americans doing normal, everyday Americans like you and me doing some really incredible things. I'm using this YouTube with the permission of Dr. David Flynn, who, if you see the credits, you'll see that he was one of the key individuals who helped with the production. You'll also recognize the voice. It's not me, I promise you. It's somebody much more important. But go ahead. Eric, you're on.
I thought I was watching a movie, Towering Inferno at first. And then I looked real close, and I noticed it was the World Trade Center. I was compelled, because I'm a type of person that can't stand by and watch other people suffer. And to me, they were suffering. They wanted to get off the island. And there was no way for them to get off the island other than the water. And I had noticed when I was watching the television, I saw a lot of, the ferries going up into the slips and taking people off. I said, fine, we could do the same thing. I could take people on my boat, get in there, take them where they have to go. And that's what we did.
On the morning of September 11th, when the towers came down, millions of people ran for safety. Hundreds of thousands of them ran south to the water's edge. That's when they realized that Manhattan is indeed an island, and that they were trapped.
They were feeling helpless, and that's the worst feeling in the world. What was a person on the ground going to do? Buildings were down. There were people laying under the rubble of the building. Firemen, civilians. My wife was there, and I turned around. I says, I've got to go do something. Just like that. And she looked at me. She says, what are you going to do, you maniac? I says, I'm going to take the amberjack up into the city and help. She says, but what if they're attacked again? I says, well, then that's something I have to live with. I says, I have to do what I have to do. I says, and nobody can stop me right now. Even if I save one person or I rescue one person, that's one person less that will suffer and die.
They were trying to evacuate Manhattan because nobody knew what was going on. You didn't know if something else was going to happen. It was just, a madness on one side and, and wanting to help people on the other side.
They were just streaming out of the buildings. And the first mode of transportation they saw was a ferry boat. That's when they knew, this is how I'm getting out of here. So they didn't even care where the boat was going.
There wasn't panic in New York in the beginning, just volume. It wasn't until the first building fell that there was panic.
You heard the building go down, but we're in the slip, so we can't see it. That's when we started letting go, and then all of a sudden, engulfed. You couldn't see anything.
People were actually jumping into the river and swimming out of Manhattan. Boats were very nearly running them over.
Wait. These people wanted out of Manhattan no matter any way they could.
Somebody wants you to go over there.
Every mode of transportation out of Manhattan was shut down. All the subways were shut. The tunnels were all closed. They closed the bridges. They closed everything immediately.
Boats, usually an afterthought in most New Yorkers' minds, were for the first time in over a century the only way in or out of Lower Manhattan.
The process actually had already started. There were some boats that were grabbing people, and people were lined up at the walls.
On the left.
It's just human nature. You see people in distress on the seawall in Manhattan begging you to pick them up. You have to pick them up.
They didn't know what was going on. They seen the building getting hit with these two planes. As far as they was concerned, we were being bombed. I was wondering if they were going to come on the boat, if they had people with bombs, or if they were going to come on. We're a big orange target in the middle of that harbor. My job is to keep the boat safe, my passengers safe, my crew safe.
Everybody was in shock, running around. They didn't want to leave their families. They had loved ones running around the city.
Everybody has a baby! Nobody has it!
There was one guy ran from the apron and jumped onto the boat. He grabbed onto the metal, lined up right next to the pilot. So I'm going out there to say something. He slides down to the next deck. So the deckhands get him and go, what are you doing? He goes, I'm jumping for my life. So, you couldn't argue with him there.
There was a small boat that was at the lower tip of Manhattan. I thought the boat was going to flip over because so many people were trying to get on. And as I looked behind, they were just 10 deep. And that's kind of what gave us the idea.
We decided that this has to get better organized and we better do it, and that's what we did.
So we decided to make the call on the radio. All available boats. This is the United States Coast Guard aboard the pilot boat New York. Anyone want to help with the evacuation of Lower Manhattan, report to Governor's Island.
When that call came on the radio, they were coming.
I was uncertain of who was going to respond. About 15, 20 minutes later, there are just boats all across the horizon.
Literally 100 targets converging on the lower part of Manhattan.
When we came out of that dust cloud, tugboats, I'd never seen so many tugboats all at once.
There was just like a fleet of tugboats headed to Manhattan.
If it floated and it could get there, it got there.
All different size, shapes, and forms. I mean, and they were zooming across this water.
Ferries, private boats, party boats.
I worked on the water for 28 years. I've never seen that many boats come together at one time that fast. One radio call and it just came together just that fast.
Hundreds of boats converged on the city, leaving the sun-bathed harbor behind them. Dead ahead, the unknown.
That was something I won't forget. It was just low, dark, acrid, black smoke. It's like there was a big chimney in Manhattan. When we pulled into Pier 11, the dust was unbelievable.
And then out of nowhere, you just kept on seeing people coming.
They looked like zombies coming through the fog, and you knew that those were human beings.
Don't leave us. Please don't leave us here. Take us. At that point, the Coast Guard said, not how many people are you allowed, how many people can you fit?
Come on, guys. Everybody coming? Get your ass over here. Now! Now! Come on!
Boats started hanging, literally would take a bedsheet off a bunk and then a can of spray paint and paint their destination on.
Some of these people never been in the water, never been on a boat before.
Housewives, workers that do windows. We had executives. And the thing that was the best, everyone helped everyone.
I want you to hold my hand. Come on board. Get inside. One at a time. Get inside.
I saw 4 businessmen lifting up an old woman with a seeing eye dog, a German Shepherd, and they lifted her up like a surfboard and passed her over the handrails.
When we would carry a load of people over, and there was somebody standing there that seen their husband or wife, that made us feel even better, Well, at least we got 2 back together, Just keep on going,
The guy that works at the ferry, he's a welder. His son was on my boat. He actually came up. He thanked me.
We went back and forth all day long, carrying boatloads, as many as our boat would hold. And it's a lot of people. A lot of people.
You couldn't have planned nothing to happen that fast, that quick.
No training. This was just people doing what they had to do that day.
You forget all about what you're supposed to do, what they teach you in school, and you say, you know what? Morally, this is the right way to go, and deep down, this is what I'm gonna do.
Average people, they stepped up, and when they needed to, they showed me, when the American people need to come together and pull together, they will do it.
I do feel a way honored that I was a part of it.
That was the greatest thing I ever did with my life.
The greatest day that I've ever seen in all my boating, my life on the water.
The great boat lift of 9/11 became the largest sea evacuation in history. Larger than the evacuation of Dunkirk in World War II, where 339,000 British and French soldiers were rescued over the course of 9 days. On 9/11, nearly 500,000 civilians were rescued from Manhattan by boat. It took less than 9 hours.
I believe somebody has a little hero in them. You gotta look in. And it's in there. It'll come out. It need to be.
I have one theory in life. I never want to say the word I should have. If I do it and I fail, I tried. If I do it and I succeed, better for me. And I tell my children the same thing. Never go through life saying you should have. If you want to do something, you do it.
Hey. Okay. So, what'd you think? Great story, huh? That's the point I'm trying to make. We don't know what's going to happen in raising conflicts. You know, we can guess, we can perhaps anticipate, but we can't be absolutely certain in our prediction. What we can be fairly certain of, though, is that we need to apply prevention. We need to build in redundancy and capacity within our own nation. And we need to take individual responsibility, community responsibility, public and private sector responsibility. You know, we just can't point our finger at somebody else and say, that's your job. It's not. It's our job. And at the same time, though, I hope that we ended at least on a high note that it can be done. Yes, sir.
I studied industrial college in the armed forces. That was supposed to study how we mobilized in World War II and record that. If you ever went to that academic program, that would be the place to put something like this for resiliency.
Yes.
Ask them to do that.
Yes. Yes.
Planning.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I agree. I think it's a great suggestion. Yeah. Questions? Goodness.
It
Sir.
somewhat dumbfounded me that a similar effort didn't happen in Katrina. And I don't know much about Katrina, but I just felt like that was handed over to the government to handle when a public sector more humane.
Well, one of the first things that has to happen is that the private sector has to have trust. And that trust, and I'm not putting fingers and laying blame, but that trust wasn't there. There was also a failure in leadership in Katrina that in many different areas that, you know, what isn't told in this story, because the Coast Guard lieutenant who made the decision to make that call to organize the boats, he's now a captain. He was one of the speakers there, but he, you know, he's not identified, you know, okay, this was his, you know, but it was one person's leadership, good idea, right place, right time, and it applied. But you are absolutely correct, sir. Katrina will need to be studied as a failure as to why we didn't help those people in a timely fashion. There's one story about the fact that you know, how fast the Coast Guard got there, which if any of you are involved with the Coast Guard, they got there in a big hurry. And the 82nd Airborne took some heat because they didn't get there in time. Now, there was a difference, and I'm going to be something of an apologist for the 82nd Airborne in the sense that the Coast Guard could deploy without a deployment order. It's consistent within their mission. 82nd Airborne needs a deployment order, and at that time, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld only signed the deployment orders on a Friday. So if something went wrong on a Saturday, you had a time to wait. I know that. Mine got signed on a Friday, and I started watching that. I never saw a major deployment order signed any other time. Now, you may have seen subsequent deployment orders that were signed, but the one that initially would start the troops, and I don't know, you used to work for Transcom. Did you see any that violated that particular?
I was at Southcom.
You were at Southcom at the time. Okay, so you weren't watching it from there. Okay, but I think Katrina needs to be looked at and dissected as to why those things went wrong, because you're absolutely correct, sir. It was a failure of leadership at a number of levels.
The other Asian Navy that came in hurricane.
Yes.
That was in these people, that was boat boats and helping people.
That's exactly right, sir.
That's exactly it. You put your finger on it. You said Coast Guard organized the 9/11 boat lift. That would have been a disaster with all the folks trying to unload as many people as they possibly could, whereas they gave them the order, take as many as you can in your capacity and go
Mhm.
somebody else is coming.
Yep.
In Katrina, they didn't. That leadership was not there. And how much of that comes out of the ideology that's taken root in our country that always points the finger at the government and says evil and says give the government out everything.
Yeah.
And then that's the military, that's the cops.
Yeah. We are the government.
Yeah. You are
We are the government.
Yeah.
We the people.
With that ideology, how does that not affect?
Yeah. I'm arguing that we need to change our mindset. We need to recognize that bad things are going to happen. Government can't protect us from everything. It's going to happen to us. And what are we doing as individuals? What are we doing as a community? And what are we doing as a nation? Set standards, apply redundancy, get capacity, ensure that your infrastructure actually works, and know who your neighbors are and help them when times get tough. Other questions? I can't have answered every question anybody ever had, other than the fact I'm painfully aware that we're getting close to the end of the day. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, sir.